Alright, welcome back everyone to the second part of this Ruby on Rails series where we build a book review application from start to finish. To recap what we did in the first part, we added the functionality to create a new book. We added a show page for each book, and we also added edit and delete functionality for those books. We set up our routes, and we installed the simple form gem and Bootstrap Sass. And we also added the root page as our index action where we're looping through all of our books here on the root path. Now I went ahead and added 3 new books. I just added those so when we add our categories, we'll have a book for each category. We're going to have 3 categories. We're going to have technology, we're going to have fantasy, and we're going to have biography. Alright, so like I was saying about categories, in this section we're going to be creating users for our application using a gem called Devise. We're going to be adding categories to our application, and we're going to be adding a navbar with links to add a book. We're going to have an ability to filter by category, and we're going to have sign up, sign in, and sign out links. So without any more delay, let's get into adding these components. So to begin the second part, let's get the Devise gem installed in our application, and let's add the ability to create new users, sign in, and sign out of our application. So let's head back over to a new tab and let's go to Ruby Gems again. And we're going to be grabbing a gem called Devise. Devise is a user authentication gem which allows users to sign in and sign out of our application. So just like we did for Bootstrap Sass in simple form, we're going to copy the gem to the clipboard and we'll go into our gem file and we're going to paste that in. And just like we did before as well, we're going to run bundle install. Okay, so once our app is using Devise, we'll head back over and let's go to the documentation for Devise and see what we need to do. So with Devise, there's not too many commands. It's actually very straightforward to get it going. The first thing we're going to do is install Devise with the command rails generate devise install. So we'll go back to our terminal, rails generate devise install. This will install Devise to our application. Bundle install allows us to use Devise, but running this installation actually allows us to install Devise. So now what we're going to do is it's going to have some things that's kind of making sure you do. In my case, I already have a root path, and I'm going to add these alert and notice messages. These are just messages that will print out text when we sign in and sign out. It'll tell us if we had a successful sign up or a sign in. That is helpful for the user to know really what's going on. And we're actually going to place these in our layout file. Now I didn't cover this in the first section, but what our layout file does is this yield tag right here inside the body tag. This is just basic HTML structure. You got your head and your body. The yield tag is where all of these views that we created will get inserted. So all the content that lies outside of this yield tag is going to be common to every view page in our application. So in our case, we're going to go down here and we're going to paste in these alert and notice tags. And now when we sign in and sign out, we'll get sort of a little idea if it was successful, if it wasn't successful, all that fun stuff. And if we go back to our terminal, we can copy Devise views. Now this Rails generate Devise views is optional, but when using Bootstrap, I would recommend generating the views because it will allow your Devise views to get that Bootstrap styling. So we're going to do Rails generate Devise views. And also in the very end, when we lay out and style our application, it will, well actually it does it right now, but we'll go into this at the very end of the app. So if we go into views, we'll actually have a folder now for Devise, and this has basically all the views we're going to be using with Devise. We're actually in this app only going to be using new user registration, which is our sign up form, and we're going to be using new user session, which is our login form. These are ones that we're going to be styling directly at the end of the app. But without that, I don't want to get ahead of myself. We'll head back and see what else we need to do. So it says Rails generate Devise model. Now in this case, model is going to correspond to the model name, and for this app, we're going to be just calling it user. So we'll go back and we'll do Rails. Let's clear this. I'm clearing the terminal with Command K. So we'll run Rails, and I forget what it was already. Rails generate Devise user. So this is going to create our essentially our user model and our user table. So as you can see right here, we have the user model, user.rb, and we have the users table. Users table migration files in the DB directory, and the user model file is in the app models directory. So to effect these changes, we're going to run rake db migrate, and this will update our application to have the users table. And after this, what we're going to do is we're going to restart the server, because when you install Devise, and just like any other gem, it's always wise to restart your server. So we'll go into our second tab here, Control C, and then Rails S again. This will restart our server. We'll head back to our application, refresh, make sure nothing's broken. And you'll see we had a little bit of padding here. This is where those alert and notice messages will go. But one thing that Devise does, which is really nice, we don't have to do ourselves, is if we go into config routes.rb, we'll see that Devise already added our routes for us. So we'll go back into the terminal, and I'll just show you the routes that it made. So we'll go to rake routes, and we'll see that we have routes for sign in, sign up, sign out, all these right here. Now all we're really going to worry about is the sign up path right here, and the sign in path right here, and also the sign out path. Those are the three we're going to be worrying about the most when we add that functionality to the Navbar, which is actually what we're going to be doing right now. So I'm going to use Command W to clean up a lot of these windows I'm not using, and we're actually going to go back into our layout file. And like I said, this is going to be something that's common across every view that we render in our application. So what I want to do is I want to add our Navbar to this, so we don't have to copy that code 15 times for every single view and every single possibility. So we're just going to add the Navbar right here. And since I'm using Bootstrap, we can go back over here, and I'll just reference the documentation so you can see where I'm getting this. If we go to Components, Navbar, let's go down a little bit. Right here is the basic Navbar structure. Now, in this application, I'm not going to be spending too much time on making it super responsive, at least for a mobile first aspect of design. I'm just going to be making it so it looks nice, and it's pretty easy to make a Bootstrap site responsive because it's responsive by nature, and it's really easy to make it mobile first. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to be following this code right here to create a simple Navbar. So we'll go in, I'll create a nav tag, and this is going to have a class of Navbar. Navbar default. Navbar default is that basic gray styling. We're going to change that to be just a white styling at the end. And I'm going to create a lot of spacing here for you guys so it's easier for you to see. I'm going to create a div with a class of container. Container simply adds margin to the left and right of your content. It centers it so it's not pressing the edges of your screen. And inside the container, I'm going to add another div. This is going to be a class of Navbar header. Now the Navbar header is going to contain our Navbar brand, which is simply just going to say book review, and that is going to link to the root path. So we'll go ahead and add that. Just create a link to tag, link to, and the text is going to be book review, and it's going to take us to the root path. Now one cool thing with Rails is we can add HTML classes right in Ruby code. So we can just go class, colon, and then quotation marks, we're just going to put our classes. One thing you need to be sure of is it's not class equals, it's class colon. So we'll do class of Navbar brand. So let's save this and go back over to our app and see our nice little ugly Navbar. Here's our Navbar brand. So say we click on one of these images here, or one of these show book links. See how the Navbar stays with each view, and if we click book review, we'll be taken to the root path. Cool. So now we have the Navbar header. Let's add our actual links, and we're going to do this with an unordered list, and I'll just call this a class of, what is it, navbar, nav. This is specifically the navigation, so it's going to give it that link styling that Bootstrap's known for. And in here, we're going to have a list item, and it's going to have, this is going to be our sign up link. Sign up, and the path that corresponds to sign up is, I keep getting rid of rake routes, so it's usually wise to keep rake routes up because you're going to be referencing it a lot. But once you use a framework like Devise and you just create URLs more and more. They'll become kind of second nature to you, so you don't have to worry too much about knowing the paths, because you'll kind of know them in your head. But sign up, if we go down here, it's new user registration. And remember, we add the underscore path to the end of that, so new user registration path. And if we go back and we refresh, we'll see a sign up link. We click that, we'll be taken to the sign up page. And as you can see, the sign up page has that bootstrap styling. That's because we generated those Devise views. Awesome. So let's go back and let's keep adding some more links. Now, one thing I want to do is, if a user is signed into our application, they should not see a link to signing in, because if a user signed in, they have no reason to sign in again. So if a user signed in, we're going to link to a sign out link, and if a user is not logged in, they'll see login and they won't see sign out. So I'm blabbering on. You guys just probably want to see this. So I'll go in here. I'm going to do just a little bit too much spacing. I'm going to do an if statement. So if user signed in, this is checking if a user is signed into our application, and I'll end that tag right away. And if a user is signed into our application, we're going to link to the sign out tag. So link to sign out, and sign out corresponds to destroy user session, and it has a method of delete. So destroy user session method delete. Alright, and I spelled that wrong. Okay, so we come back over here. We're not going to see it because we're not signed in. And we'll add an else statement. So the else statement is going to correspond to if a user is not signed in, which is what we are right now. We'll do another link to, but this time it's going to link to login. So link to login, and the sign in or login is new user session. New user session path. Oh, I need to add path here. That would have been a mistake. So we'll refresh and we'll see login. Awesome. So with our navbar having some conditional styling, let's actually go ahead really quick here. And actually, I'll add that when we add the categories. The add book link I'm going to add up here in a little bit, but let's just go ahead and create a user right now. So go to sign up, and I'm going to create a user, just call him John Snow. Create a password, and we'll create a confirmation. So we'll sign up, and we'll see right here's our alert message in action. Welcome, you have signed up successfully. Awesome. And now, since we're signed in, we see the sign out link, and we don't see the login link. So let's make sure that works. We'll sign out. Signed out successfully, and let's log in again. John Snow. Let's log in, and we signed in successfully. Awesome. I'm just going to refresh the page to get rid of that. Let's actually just go ahead and add that add book link. So this one right here, that takes us to the new book page. Let's just throw that up here in our navbar. So to do that, let's just create another unordered list. The reason we're creating another unordered list and not just adding it to this one is because we want to float this to the right. We don't want to have too much cluttered on the left side of our page. It's going to have the same styling, class of nav, navbar, nav. And this is just going to say, actually, we're going to do the same conditional. We don't want a user to see the add book link if they're not signed in. So we'll make it sort of a requirement that you have to have an account to post a new book to the website. So just like the other one, we'll do if user signed in, and we'll end that. So if the user is signed in, then we will, oh boy, my mouse works pretty bad. So if the user is signed in, then we'll link to add book. Link to add book, and this is going to be new book path. And right before we do that, let's actually get rid of the old link right in here, and we'll go back over, we'll refresh, and I forgot to add the class of navbar right. This will float this little navbar section over here to the right. Awesome. We click that, and we get taken to the new book link. The next thing we want to deal with is associating a book that's posted by a user with that current user. So what we want to do to start is we want to add the user ID attribute to our book model. So if we go into the Rails console, new Rails console, and we're going to look at what book has. We added the user model, but it's not associated yet with book. So we'll do book.connection, and we'll just do book. And what we want to see here is we want to see user ID, but we don't see that right now. So the first thing we want to do is we want to generate a migration. Now in Rails, a migration is a way of updating the database without creating a new table or creating a new model, essentially. What we're going to do is we're just going to add user ID to books. So we can get out of the console. We'll run the command Rails generate migration. And now we're going to do add underscore user underscore ID underscore to underscore books. A lot of underscores, but it's just the way it works. So add user ID to books. Now we're going to specify what user ID is. User ID is an integer. So Rails generate migration, add user ID to books, user ID integer. Alright, so we'll generate that migration, and we'll see we got a migration file. Add user ID to books. So let's go back to here, and let's just see what that migration file looks like. So add user ID to books, and we'll see we're adding user ID, which is an integer, to the books table. Awesome. That's just what we want. So now let's do rake db migrate to update our database. And now if we go back into the Rails console and we connect to a book again and we look at the book model, we'll see right here we have a user ID. Even though book has a user ID, when we create a book, it's still not going to get associated with that current user. So what we need to do is we need to change the way we create a book. Instead of just creating a book as it is, we're going to create a book from the current user. So let's go ahead and dive back into Sublime, into our books controller. What we're going to do is we're going to update the new action and the create action. Because right now it's just creating a standalone book. It's not associating it with a user. So what we want to do, go into new, it's going to be a current user .books .build. So what this line of code is doing is it's building out books from the current user. And we're going to do the same exact thing down here. If I can actually copy this, there we go. It's doing the same thing down here for create. But this time, create is taking in book param, just like it was beforehand. When the user fills out the form, those are the params that's getting passed in. So now if we go back to the our browser, lost my train of thought there for a second, and let's just say we want to add a book. We're going to get an undefined method, books. Now what this means is we don't have associations right now. And to add associations, we're going to go into our model files and we're going to add them. Associations are just ways of, well, associating one model with another. So if we go into the book model first, there's two basic ways we can do this. You can have a has many and belongs to. Now a book belongs to a user. So we're just going to do belongs to user. And user has many books. So a user can make many books and a book can belong to a user. So with that added, we'll go back here, we'll refresh, and we'll go to add book, and now we won't get that error because now we have the association. So let's go ahead and create a book. In my case, I want to do, what do I want to do? Let's do the third Game of Thrones book. So Game of Thrones book 3. We'll get the title right here, Storm of Swords. Paste that in. And let's get some more hipster text here. Paste that in. And the author again is George R.R. Martin. And let's create that book. Alright, so we didn't get an error. And let's dig into the Rails console and make sure that our book was created with respect to who we're signed in as. And we're signed in as the first user with the email of Jon Snow. So we'll go back here, and again we'll do book.connection, and we'll do @book gets book.last. If we look in here, this is when we just made a Storm of Swords, and it has the user ID of 1. Now it's being associated with a user ID. And just to show you that the other books don't have a user ID, we'll do a book.first, and we'll see that the user ID for that is nil. So what we want to do is we want to update those books that have a user ID. Now we'll just assume that the first user made all those books, so we don't have to delete them all and remake them. So to do that, we access the book we want, and we do appbook.user ID. We're accessing the attribute, and we're going to set it equal to 1, the first user. And then we're going to save that. And now we'll do the same thing. We're going to do book, so we need to find the other ones. Book.find2 has a user ID of 1 because we deleted the book with an ID of 1. If you remember back when we deleted the first Game of Thrones book. Book.find3. Again, I'm just hitting the up arrow to do this. Set the user ID and save. I'm going to be doing the same thing for these. Just up arrow, set the user ID, find the book, set the user ID, and then save it. And save. And I think that is all of them. Yeah, right here is Storm of Swords again. Okay. So with that now being done, all these books are... Oh, sorry for the motion sickness there. All of the books are associated with a current user. Now what we want to do is we want to create another user just for the purpose of sort of having another user. So we'll sign out. Let's just create another one. This one will be Ned Stark. Create a password. And let's just create a book with him quick. Let's do the Fellowship of the Ring. I don't know why this has such a long title. Let's do the Fellowship of the Ring. The reason I'm picking these books is because I downloaded all the images beforehand, so it'll be easier for me to include all those. Grab some text. And this is J.R. Tolkien. Create that, and now let's just make sure that this book we just created is associated with the second user. So we'll do book.connection. At book gets book.last, and this should have a user ID of 2, which it does. Sweet. An important piece of functionality we want to implement for this application is we don't want a user who did not create a book to be able to edit or delete that book. So to do that, we're going to add another conditional. So we're going to go back to our book show page, because that's where we have our links, views, books, show. And we're going to add a conditional around this. The edit and delete links. We always want the backlink to be there. So we're going to check if the book.user ID. So if the book's user ID is equivalent to the current user's ID, so that's essentially saying what it means, we want these links to appear. And if not, they won't appear. So we'll do end. Now one thing, I also want to wrap another if statement around this, and this next one's going to check if a user is signed in. This is going to save a problem where if we don't have a user signed in, they can still view the show page for a book. And if there's no user signed in, the current user is going to have a nil value. And if it has a nil value, you can't call a method or an attribute on it. So before we even do that, we want to check if user that we've been doing, we want to check if a user is signed in. So if user is signed in, we want to do all this. And we'll end. If a user is not signed in, it still will not show this stuff. So if we go back over, we're signed in as Ned Stark, who only created this book. So we'll see edit and delete for him, but if we go to another one, we won't see it. So we're preventing a user who didn't create a book from being able to destroy or edit that book. Alright, we're making good progress. So the next thing we want to do is we want to add categories to this application. If you remember from the final application, up here we have a categories dropdown. We want each time we click on one of those categories, we want to filter these books so that only the books with that category are shown. So the first thing we want to do is we want to go into our Rails console. We want to go into our terminal and we want to create a category model. Now the category model is pretty simple. All it is a name of the category. So we're going to do Rails generate model. In this case, it's going to be the category model. It's going to have a name attribute, which is a string. So Rails generate model, category, name string. And we'll see we have the create categories table, and we'll have the category model. So let's go in and see that migration file just to show that it's there. Right here, create table categories with a name attribute, which is a string. Awesome. So we'll go back in here, and now we want to update our database, rake db migrate, and we'll wait for that to be done. So at the current state in our app, the category ID is not associated with a book, and that's what we want. We want to associate a book with a category ID because we're going to use that ID to then filter those books. So just like we did for adding a user ID to book, we're going to do the same thing for adding a category ID to book. We're going to do a Rails generate migration. We're going to do add category ID to books. And the category ID is going to be an integer. So Rails generate migration, add category ID to books, category ID being an integer. So run that migration, and then we'll run rake db migrate again to update our database. And once again, let's check out that migration file that was created. See, we're adding category ID, which is an integer, to the books table. Awesome. So everything's looking good so far. And now what we want to do is we want to go into our Rails console and make sure that category ID is part of the book model. So we'll do book.connection, and we'll look at the book model, and we'll see we have category ID is part of book. And now, just like we did previously, let's add associations between category and book. We're not going to have an association between category and user because the category is going to be set up by default. Users won't be able to create categories. So let's just go into our book, and a book is going to belongs to category. And now, since we have our category model file, open that up, which is currently blank, and a category has many books. So with those associations set up, now we have an association between category and book. Even though the books and the category are now associated, we need to have a way that when we create a new book, we can select one of the categories to put it in, so we don't have to keep going into the console and adding it after the fact. So to do that, we're going to go back into our books controller. Let's clean up some of these windows here, clean up some of these collapsed files here, and we'll go into books controller. Now what we want to add to start is we want to add a way to access categories when we create a new book. So to do that, we're going to do at categories in our new action because we want it to be available in the new .html.erb view template. So at categories gets category, which is going to access the model of all of our categories, .all, .map, and we're going to map C, we're going to represent it as C, and do c.name, c.id. Alright, so now we'll swing into our new.html.erb template here. And remember, we're rendering the form, so we have at categories available in here, which means we also have it available in here because this is being rendered in the new template. And we're going to add a way to select a category. And to do that, we're going to use a select tag. So we're going to add another here. We'll do select tag. I'm going to select category ID. I'm going to set options for select, and these options are going to represent all of the categories we have, which will be 3. We're going to have, remember, technology, biography, and fantasy. Options for select is going to be the categories. And then we're going to actually have a little prompt, and the prompt here is simply going to display text on the select field. So it's not just going to have the first category showing. It's going to be, hey, select a category, so it can tell the user what we want them to do. Select a category. Alright, so now if we head back into our application and we go to add book, we're going to see a drop down here, a select. Now what we want this to show below here is the 3 categories we want, but we haven't defined any categories yet. And I see a a little typo there. Let me get rid of that. Okay, so to add categories, we're actually going to go into the console to add these categories. Actually, one thing I want to do before that, let's go back into our books controller here. And in our create action, before we run into this problem later, we want to associate a book with a category ID. Even though we're selecting we can select categories now once we add them, we still don't have a way to associate the book with that category. So to do that, we're going to do @book, and we're going to set its category ID attribute to the category ID that it's passed in when we submit the form. So when we submit a form, it'll now associate the book with the category ID we selected. And now, like I said, let's go into the Rails console and let's add some categories. So do category.connection. We're going to have all this mumbo jumbo there. And to do that, we're going to do category.create. Remember, our attribute is the name attribute, so we're going to set name to the name of the category. So we'll do fantasy. So category.create name fantasy. Hit the up arrow. You want technology. Now these are saving automatically because we're using the create method that automatically saves it. If we used category.new, we'd have to save it. But this just makes it a lot quicker. So category.name, category.create, and we want the last one to be biography. Alright, so now we have 3 categories. So we'll do category .all, and we'll see we have fantasy, we have technology, and we have biography. That's what we want. Now in a real application, you would want more categories than just 3, but for the sake of this application, we're just going to stick with 3, make it simple and easier to understand. So now that we have those, we're going to go back into our add book here, and we're going to see we have selected categories still, and we're going to see those 3 categories that we selected. So with that being now implemented, when we fill out a form here and we create it, it will be associated with a user. But there's one last thing we need to do. We need to update the book params here to also permit category ID. Since category ID is now part of book, we need to permit it, even though we're setting the book's category ID to be what we're passing in. We still need to permit it, or it's not going to set the category ID. So we'll do category ID. So now if we head over and we refresh, let's add a technology book. I think one was let's do the principles of object-oriented JavaScript. Add some text for that. I'm actually not sure the author on the top of my head. Nicholas C. Zakis. Add that. It's the author, and let's get some filler text. So when we create this and we look into the console for this book, it should be associated with a category ID of 2, because technology is the second category. We create that book and it was created successfully. Go into the Rails console again. Rails C. I'll do book connection, and we'll do @book gets book.last. And we'll see right here we have a category ID of 2, meaning it's associated with the technology category. Awesome. So with newly created books now being associated with a category, we need to associate all the other books we have previously with a category. So to do that, we're going to do what we did for books and the user ID. We're going to do that same similar approach, and we're going to do it for the category ID. So let's do @book gets, let's do book.first to start. And this is a Clash of Kings. So this is a fantasy book. And remember, a cool thing about our drop down here is it puts them in order of ID. So fantasy has an ID of 1, technology an ID of 2, and biography an ID of 3. So fantasy was an ID of 1. So we want to do @book.category ID gets 1. @book.save, and we're going to repeat this process for all of the other books. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll do @book get book.find ID of 2. Okay, that's the one we already had. That was actually the first book. Book.3 is HTML and CSS. That is going to be a technology book, which is an ID of 2. And let's save that. And again, I'm just using the up arrow to do this as quick as I can. This is another Game of Thrones book, so that's going to have a category ID of 1 because it's fantasy. Save that. 5, we have Steve Jobs. That's actually going to be a biography. That's an ID of 3. Save. And I think we have one more book. Storm of Swords. Again, that's another Game of Thrones book. Category ID, it's going to be a fantasy, so ID of 1. Save that book. And let's make sure that's everything. Actually, no, we have The Fellowship still. That's also a fantasy book. It's a fantasy heavy book review site here. We'll save that. And that should be all of them. 8. Yep, this is the one we added when we created it, the object-oriented JavaScript, which is technology. Alright, let's get out of the console and let's go on to the next section. So one thing I want to add really quick is on our show page for our books, I want to add just the category it has. This will be deleted later on, but it will just help us know that everything's working fine. So we'll go into the show page for a book, and under the author, let's do a header 4, and it's going to be @book.category.name. So this is getting the category of the book, and it's getting the name of that category. And let's actually prefix that with category, and this should then show the name of the category. Awesome. Category technology. So if we go back here, this should be biography. This is also a good way to check to make sure you had all of your categories updated correctly in the console. And this is technology. Alright, awesome. Everything is looking pretty good. We have books being associated with categories when we create them, and we have all the other books also associated with categories. Now, if you remember, we didn't add any code to the edit or update actions in the book's controller. So we're going to add the same thing we added to the new action up here, the mapping the categories. We're going to add that to the edit action. This is just so when we edit the form, we have access to all those categories that we had when we created a book. So we'll add that, and then for update, we're going to add the same thing we added to create when we set the book's category ID to the params that we passed into the form. So we'll paste that in as well. And now, if we go over, we're going to run into a problem here. Say we want to edit the Steve Jobs biography, and we're not signed in with who created that. So let's do Fellowship of the Ring, and we go to edit. We're going to see that the category is not filled in by default. Now, this was something that gave me a lot of frustration when I was recording or making this app for the first time, trying to figure out how we can pass in this case, it'd be fantasy here when we first click on edit form. But as you see, we don't have that right away, so a user could simply just go to update, and then it's not going to have a category, which is a problem. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that this has a category filled in when we click on the edit book form. And to do that, we're going to actually use a new or a different tag. Instead of using the select tag like we used for the form partial, we're just going to be using a f.select. So to do that, we're not going to create another form partial, but we're going to copy this form partial, and in our edit view, we're going to add this form, but we're going to change this select tag. Everything else is going to be the same, but this is now just going to be f.select category ID, and at categories. So this is going to fill in the category select with the current category that we have that was selected beforehand. And one thing we also want to add is we want to add a little thing up here, HTML and it's going to say multi-part true. One thing I forgot to add, I'm just going to add this right now. When we add the ability to upload images for our books, we need to add HTML multi-part true. So I don't forget to do that when we add the paperclip gem and add the ability to upload images. So like I said, we have the f.select category ID, and it's going to have all these categories. So we'll go back into the form partial here. We're going to add the multi-part to there as well. So now if we go back over here and we refresh, we'll see fantasy is filled in by default. So we'll go back here, and we also got rid of the prompt because I don't think the prompt would be necessary when you're editing because you already created one. So we didn't create that either. Principles of object-oriented JavaScript. When we click edit, it should say technology, and it does. Awesome. So now our edit form is working with the category ID. We're able to create books associated with the category ID. And what we want to do now is we want to focus, or we want to add the ability to filter by category ID. Let's begin by adding a drop-down of all the categories we have in our navbar. And when we click on a category, we will filter out all the books that aren't associated with that category. So say we have a drop-down, click on technology, all we want to see is principles of object-oriented JavaScript and HTML and CSS. And it'd be the same for other categories, but different books would be shown. So to do that, let's go into our application layout file, and we're going to add the category drop-down to our navbar right here. Let's put it on the right side. So we'll create some room. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a list item again, and these classes are going to be bootstrap classes. So we'll do class of drop-down, and we'll have class drop-down, and inside here we're going to have an anchor. Href is just going to be fill it in there. Class of drop-down toggle. Now these are still all bootstrap classes. I have a data toggle of, I believe it's drop-down. It's going to have a row of a button. Area expanded. False. Now all this can be found on the GitHub or on the Git Bootstrap website. And that's going to be all for that. And now we're going to do categories. And then after that, we want to have a little downwards caret to denote that it's a drop-down. So we'll do a span tag with a class of caret. And Bootstrap's awesome. You can just denote a class of caret, and we'll have a little caret symbol. Okay, so inside here, now we want to list all the categories. So we're going to create another unordered list inside our drop-down. And this is going to have a class of drop-down menu. Class drop down menu, and it's going to have a role of menu, and in here we're going to loop through and create a list item for each category. So we're going to get all of our categories by category.all, and then for each category we'll represent each category with we'll represent each category with just the word category. And we'll end that right away so I don't forget. And in here we're going to create a list item tag for each category. And now to get each category, what we're going to do is we're going to link to the category.name. Remember, category represents each instance, so we're going to get the name of each instance, and it's going to go to the books path. Now the books path is the index page. So if we go back to over here and rake routes, and we look at the index action, it is, if it would load, here we go, books. So index action is books, and you add the underscore path, so books path. And what we're going to do is when we visit the index action, we want to pass a params, which will appear in the URL. It's going to be the category and the category name. So category gets category.name. So this is going to pass the name of the category to the sort of in the URL as params. So then we're going to access that category name when we filter out, when we go into our index action for the books controller. We'll be able to use the params that we're passing in right here, the category name, to filter the books. So it'll make a little bit more sense when I implement it. And then we're also going to add a class of just link. So we go back over here and we refresh. We're going to see our category dropdown with our 3 categories. Awesome, it's working good. But if we click, we'll see that we go to category. We'll get category equals technology. So like I said, category, and it's getting assigned the name of the category. We're going to use this to filter out what we want here. So we go back here, and what we're going to do is we're going to go into the books controller, and in our index action, we're going to add some code. We're going to add a conditional, and we're going to see if the category params that we passed are blank, meaning that we didn't pass anything, and we're just on the root page, we want to display how we've been displaying. We want to display all the books because we're not filtering. So we'll tab that in, and else, meaning that if we pass params in, so depending on what the param is, we're going to display just those books. So we'll do @category ID gets category dot find by name, which we're basically finding the name that is being passed into the param. So params category the ID. So this is getting the ID of the category that we're passing in up here. So if we click on this, this is what we're getting right here. We're getting the category ID of this category. Oops, I didn't want to do that. I'm back over here and at books. So instead of displaying all the books, we're just going to get the book where the category ID equals the category ID attribute. So the book's category ID equals the category ID, which we calculated up here. And we're going to order that just like we did the other ones by created at descending. So let's refresh and let's try this out again. And I expect the word end. Oop, I forgot to end the if conditional here. And we'll refresh again. And let's filter for the fantasy books. So for fantasy, we should see the Game of Thrones books and Fellowship of the Ring. Click that, and we see Fellowship of the Ring and the Game of Thrones books. Awesome. The same thing for technology, and same thing for biography. Sweet. So the conditional is checking to see if the category params ID, so it gets this name, it checks the ID for that name, and it basically checks it against the category ID for each book. And if they're equal, they display books here, and if they're not, they won't display the books. And again, if there's no params up here, it's not going to display any filtering. It's not going to filter at all. It's just going to display all of our books. I want to clean up the output a little bit, though, of the when I filter by category. So if I click on technology, it doesn't say this is the technology category. A typical user is not going to really be able to understand that this is the technology one for sure, because it just has some URL parameters. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into our index page. I'm going to add another conditional. Now what this conditional is going to do is it's going to first output if there's a category. I'll give it a class quick of current category. And in here, I'm going to output params category. And remember, the category params is the category name. So if I go over here and I refresh, I'm going to see the word technology. So this is basically outputting the name right up here. Let's say biography. Okay, awesome, that's working. So another thing I want to do is, we're not going to see this right now, but I want to add another conditional that checks if books.count. Remember, books is available because we defined it up here and here. If books.count equals 0, meaning that if there are no books in the category, we want to display a message that actually says, hey, let's just say there are no books currently in this category. So we'll save that, and we'll run an else statement. And if there are books in the category, or if there are books at all, we will output those books like we've been doing. This is just a little detail that would be something you would want in a finished application. And let's add some spacing. Okay, awesome. So if we go in, say I want to delete Steve Jobs here. Sign out. Just want to show you that conditional. Log in. It's John Snow. Steve Jobs. And we'll delete that. When we delete it and we go to biography, we'll see there are no books currently in this category. So it's just telling the user, hey, nothing's wrong on your end. There are just no books currently in this category. So the last thing we want to do for our categories is we want to add a conditional. This is more of a styling thing, but when we click on, or when we're on a category, we want that to be highlighted as the active category. So to do that, we're going to go back into our application layout file, which is right here, and we're going to add a conditional for setting a class of active. So right here is the category name. So in here we want to add the conditional. So class equals, and here we're going to add the conditional that will set a class of active when it's active. So to set a class of active, if params category, so if the category name or the category params, which is corresponding to the category name, equals the category name. That should be category.name. So if the params that are passed in here equal the category name, that will be active. So it's saved. Let's refresh. If we look here, we'll see technology is now highlighted as the active one. So if we go to fantasy and we click here again, fantasy is now active. Awesome. So with that piece of functionality, this section is now complete. Let's do a little overview of everything that we did. We'll go to the root page. We'll see all of our books, and we can filter based on a category now, which each book is associated with. If we have no books in a category, we'll get a message here. And again, technology, there's those books. And when we add a book, we can associate it with the category. So since we deleted the Steve Jobs book, we will add it again. Let's just grab some filler text, paste that in. This is by Walter Isaacson. Now remember, we're selecting the category of biography, and we'll create the book. And if we filter biography, Steve Jobs now appears. Awesome. So that is the second part down. In the next part, which is part 3, we're going to be adding the paperclip gem so we can finally display the book images instead of this, this title setup we got going here. And we're also going to lay this out a little bit so it looks a little bit nicer. So I'll see you guys in part 3.